Welcome to ReflectInQuiry. This is a space for thoughtful conversations about the questions that shape our everyday lives. Today, I am joined by Dr. Loretta J. Ross, activist, public intellectual, professor, writer, and one of the leading voices in the reproductive justice movement, as well as in the practice of calling people in rather than calling them out. Dr. Ross, thank you so much for joining us in today's conversation.
Thanks for having me on your show.
Many people encounter your work through activism. And one of the things I've been reflecting on is that those extraordinary moments don't always come out of nowhere. The way we respond to these moments is often shaped by how we practice being human in ordinary ones. Today, I'd like to spend some time on those more quiet reflections that shape how someone becomes the kind of person that can respond with courage or compassion when those bigger moments arise. What does that kind of reflection look like for you in your life?
Well, anyone who's ever parented a child or had a toxic boss knows how to put themselves on pause before they blurt out the first thing that's on their mind because they know they can get fired if they do or send their child to therapy for life. And so when I teach calling in, I teach about the urgency of that pause before your trauma speaks, because that pause allows you to reach for your integrity and your intelligence, and then say the words that you won't be ashamed of, that you don't want to recall. And so that's what everyday practice that I'm trying to engage in, not just let my trauma lead and be trauma driven so that I'm blurting out whatever feeling that I'm having, but in fact, be in charge of my utterances to say, okay, I don't have to respond immediately. I can pause. I can take my temperature, see where I am in the moment, and then offer whatever I've got to say with as much grace and compassion as I have available to me at the time. And so I find if we take our everyday practices and use them more universally, more intentionally, we can really make a difference in how we communicate with people, whether there's someone really close to us, like our child, or even a stranger at the driver's license bureau who's being rude to you. You can put yourself on pause and respond with kindness. One thing I always say is that you can say what you mean and mean what you say, but you don't have to say it mean. That's always a choice. And I never want to say things in a mean way. I like to be a child of logic. And if blurting out the first thing that occurs to me was effective, I'd continue to do it. But it never produces the results that I want because the results are often driven by my trauma, my anger, whatever. And that's never going to make people want to hear more from me. They're not want to listen because I'm already embarrassing them or shaming them or disrespecting their intelligence. I mean, all of those things that I'm producing in them is going to interfere with their ability to hear me. And so I don't want to do those things that cause people to shut down their hearing because I want to be heard. Even I don't want to, paper over harm or fail to hold people accountable or fail to speak my truth. I just want to offer it with as much compassion as I can summon.
Now, do you think that it's possible to practice justice in the world without first practicing it in our closest relationships?
Well, it's kind of bidirectional and can happen simultaneously. I found that learning from the social justice movement how to attach words to my trauma made it easier to speak to my family because they were also coming from their trauma. And until I could explain and understand what my mother and father were going through, then I didn't have the words to really talk to them as one adult. to another. And so whenever someone comes at me and I experience it negatively, instead of assuming it's about me, I tend to assume it's about them and their trauma. And that makes me less defensive, less ready to go on the attack, less protective. It makes me more calm to say, okay, is it really about me or is it really about them and what they're carrying? And I like to think that I want to offer people the same benefit of the doubt that I would receive, that I want. I want to appreciate their complexity like I want them to appreciate mine. And it's always a practice. No one comes out knowing how to do this stuff automatically. But isn't all life striving to do and be better? And so even though I'm a senior citizen arriving at this, I'm glad I got it before I died, you know, and I would have appreciated learning it as a student when I was in college. But that kind of integrity intelligence and relational intelligence and emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence weren't taught to me in my college years. They were just, teaching me the subjects, but they weren't teaching me successful techniques of adulting. And I wish they had done that. And so that's what I'm trying to imbue in my students today, that now you can learn the topic and the subject, but you also got to learn how to handle this knowledge responsibly so that you're not weaponizing what you know against others who don't agree with you or who haven't had the privilege of your education. It's really part of a professor's job to help people leave your classroom better off than they were before. And I'm talking about coping with the challenges of life, not just passing a test on a subject.
In the educational space, what can that look like to then say, let's also welcome the unlearning process while we learn?
Well, think about the patterns that are set in your childhood. When you made a mistake as a child, and if you were severely punished and shamed for making that mistake, then you're going to think it's normal and natural to punish and shame others for making mistakes because you have not learned how to forgive yourself. And that means you don't learn how to forgive others for not being perfect. But on the other hand, if you made a mistake and you were assured that you were loved despite making that mistake, and you were taught what you could learn from making that mistake and learn that mistakes are not fatal and that you don't have to be perfect to be loved, then you're going to be predisposed to offer that kind of grace and forgiveness that you've learned to others. And so much of adulting is learning to interrupt those toxic patterns that were imprinted on us while we were young. And as adults, to make different choices. I want to learn how to forgive myself for not being perfect. And I want to learn to not only forgive others for not being perfect, but welcome my own and their imperfections as part of the variety of the human experience, a part of the joy of learning about differences and diversity and how exciting it is to recognize that every human being has a different lived experience. And I can learn something from nearly all of them. And I really love learning. And it's not just academically, but in life. And so it makes being alive so much more fun when you enjoy human diversity rather than fear it. People can only grow when they're offered a chance to grow. And if you foreclose opportunities for people to self reflect, to rethink what they thought they were certain about in the past, then you're not going to get the results of them growing. And I know personally, sometimes things have to be said to me several times for me to get it. I'm not a one and done kind of a girl because I'm kind of hard headed and stubborn. And so that means that maybe this isn't the moment for them to learn that thing you're offering them right now. And so you don't have to take responsibility for their inability to hear you or learn it right now, but you can take immense pride in the fact that you made the offer, that you made the effort. And maybe this is the fifth time they've heard it. And maybe the sixth one will be successful because you made the fifth. You don't know. It's kind of like the butterfly effect. You don't know what ripples are going to happen, but you're kind of glad that you did what you could do. I really urge people not to let our egos assume that we have the magic power to change people because we really don't. I mean, if we had the power to change people, married couples wouldn't fight or siblings wouldn't fight. Parents wouldn't fight with their children. We can't change people, but we can model behaviors we'd like them to emulate. We can showcase our values and our truths in a way that doesn't cause harm. One of the things I often say to people is that you don't have to hurt somebody to prove you've been hurt. That's always a choice. You can learn from your pain and commit not to sharing it. Commit not to hurting others just because you haven't healed yet. That again is always a choice. And so I tend not to let people get away with stuff like that and say, okay, I'm hurting, so I've got the right to make everybody as miserable as me. No, well, you may have that right, but I'm going to ask you, why would you want to do it that way? Is that how you want to show up? A bundle of rage and pain going around, scattergunning your hurt around everybody else? Do you really want a world that's equally miserable as you? I mean, is that what you're aiming for? Take responsibility for how you show up. And always remember that you're more than the sum of whatever happened to you. The way I put it in one of my books is that I refuse to let the man who raped me leave his dirty fingerprints on my life. I wanted to determine who I was, even though that happened when I was 11 years old. I didn't even know what rape was, but I knew I was always going to be more than just his victim. And so maybe that's that fierce determination that was always in me that I didn't have the words for at 11. But now that I'm 72, I can recognize that I'm still that determined 11-year-old girl that's going to determine how her life turns out and not let others' opinions of me control my fate. I'm just not going to let that happen.
Words are so powerful. Thank you for that response. The last question I have for you is, have you ever found yourself in a place where you felt like someone was calling you in when they had the opportunity to call you out?
Oh, yes.
Mm.
My God.
Yes.
Even it was not even one of my students, but a student at my college. I was in my class. The course I teach is called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump. So obviously, I'm always talking about fascism and hate and what we can do to respond to it. Because I also think that love is the antidote to hate. So I'm teaching about the ugliness of life and the resistance to that ugliness. And so I had said some things in my class about trans people that had to do with actually cautioning them on taking hormone replacement therapies for decades because I was sterilized when I was 23 years old. And I was advised back then in 1973 that HRTs had only been tested for use for 3 or 4 years. And so I was cautioning trans people who were taking HRTs that these drugs have not been tested for multi-decade use. I was called in by a trans student at my college, and when she first sought the appointment with me, I was so nervous. I was like, "Oh my God, this student, I'm not even in my class, is gonna call me out. I'm trying to be so careful and so respectful." Do you know, instead of calling me out, she called me in. She said, "Professor Ross, I need you to learn that there's a lot more development on HRTs than happened in the 1970s." Because I hadn't done any recent research to bolster my analysis. I just had the lived experience of understanding that I wouldn't even take Bayer aspirin for 40 years, much less Primarin, which was the drug that was offered to me back then. So that was an example of a student who could have called me out for being ill-informed and instead chose to call me in. And now she's one of my best teaching assistants. She signed up for my class after we had that conversation. I have one other example that also deals with a trans student, because you go through all of these elaborate introductions when you initiate a class, you know, your name, your gender pronoun, where you're from. Wouldn't you know, I misgendered a student on the first day. After hearing their name and gender pronoun only 5 minutes before. And the student, this 18-year-old student, looked at me and said, "That's all right, Professor. I misgender myself sometimes." That act of forgiveness, that refusal to be offended, that grace, we should practice that more often in many, many ways, many, many times. Choose not to be offended just because you could be. Be as generous to others as you would want someone to be to you, because you know you're not perfect. You know you will make mistakes, and the larger your platform, the more visible your mistakes. And so if you learn to forgive yourself for not being perfect, and then you offer that same kind of grace to others, you will accept your vulnerabilities as strengths. You can say, "Wow, I messed that up, and I'm glad that I've learned something from it because I'm going to do it better next time." And what did Maya say? When you know more, you'll do better. And that's the kind of grace we have to offer ourselves and to others. And life becomes so much more fun when you realize that I can delight and have joy in being an imperfect human being, because the cause that I serve, human rights, is perfect. And I don't have to be perfect to work on behalf of my people.
Thank you for joining today's conversation with Dr. Loretta J. Ross. What does it look like to pause before trauma speaks? And in that pause, to choose not to be offended, to call someone in rather than call them out. Dr. Ross's book, Calling In, is available across many different platforms, but will also be linked in today's episode notes and at reflectinquiry.com. Until our next reflection, thank you for listening to today's conversation.